Have you ever noticed how, even in moments of silence, your mind keeps making noise, as if something inside you never shuts down, never rests, never finds real peace? It is as if there were a constant, repetitive, tiring dialogue which insists on revisiting old pains, concerns that have not even happened yet, and questions that never find an answer. And the more you try to control these thoughts, the more they seem to grow, like waves that don't stop crashing day and night without giving you room to breathe. There are nights when the body even lies down, but the mind continues to stand, walking from one side to the other, reliving scenes, creating scenarios, anticipating fears. Time seems slower, the external silence becomes heavy, almost uncomfortable, as if hiding something you haven't been able to understand yet. And deep down, there is a feeling that is difficult to explain, as if something is missing, as if there is a key that you never found, a path that has always been there, but has remained invisible. What if I told you that this silence you try to avoid is not empty, but a place where something powerful happens, a space where God begins to act in a way that does not depend on words, nor on human effort, but on something much deeper? There is a spiritual principle, old and forgotten by many, that explains why your mind has not yet found rest, even though it seeks answers in so many places. The most intriguing thing is that this path is not hidden in something complicated, but in something too simple to be valued. A kind of silence that is not absence, but presence. A way of quieting down that does not weaken, but strengthens. Something that has always been accessible, but rarely practiced in the right way. And that's exactly what is beginning to be revealed now. Not as a theory, but as a real experience, capable of transforming what you feel, what you think, and the way you live. There is a way out of this mental cycle, and it is not where most people look. If you stay until the end, something inside you can finally find what you're looking for, perhaps even today. Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted on earth." And as you continue here, something begins to quietly fall into place within you, because what will be revealed are not just words, but spiritual principles that have the power to rearrange what seems confusing today. You will understand how God acts in the invisible, how he touches wounds that no one sees, and how he transforms thoughts that seem impossible to control, bringing a peace that does not depend on what is happening around you. Each teaching has been carefully revealed in Scripture and carries the ability to renew your mind, strengthen your faith, and rekindle a hope that may be weakened. And as you move forward, you may perceive something different, as if God is speaking directly to you at this moment. If this message has already started to touch your heart, like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because this can lead that same word to someone who needs exactly that today. Romans 12:2, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." There is something curious about silence that almost no one notices, because most people run away from it without understanding what they are really avoiding. Silence is not empty. It is an environment, a space where something begins to happen invisibly, but profoundly real. And this is exactly where many get lost, because they expect God to speak in the midst of the noise, in the midst of the haste, in the midst of the confusion of their own thoughts, when in fact he chooses a completely different path, a deeper, more subtle, more transformative path. Elijah reached a point where his mind was completely overwhelmed by fear, exhaustion, and a sense of escape that seemed to have no end. He had faced great battles, seen miracles, but still inside him there was a weariness that no external result could solve. And perhaps this sounds familiar to you, because there are times when, even after so many fights won, the mind remains tired, restless, without rest. Then something unexpected happens. God does not manifest himself in the way Elijah could imagine. It did not come in the strong wind that broke the rocks. It did not come in the earthquake that shook the earth. It did not come in the fire that consumed everything. All of this happened, but God was not there. And this breaks a common expectation, because it is often thought that God will act in a great, visible, impactful way. But it was not so. After all this, something almost imperceptible came. A soft, delicate, silent voice. And that's where God was. This reveals a profound principle that changes everything. The mind is not transformed in the midst of chaos, but in the stillness that few have the courage to access. Because silencing is not just about stopping talking, it's about stopping reacting. It's about allowing thoughts to slow down. It's about creating space for something bigger to take over. It is in this place that God begins to reorganize what is confused, to bring clarity where there was only doubt, to plant direction where there was once indecision. And the most challenging thing is that this process does not depend on intense effort, but on surrender, because the more you try to control your mind, the more it resists. But when you really quiet down, something changes. Something begins to line up from the inside out, silently but powerfully. Perhaps what is missing is not more answers, but less noise. Perhaps God is already speaking, but the mind has not yet learned to hear in this way. 1 Kings 19:12. And after the fire, a still small voice. If this message has touched you in any way, and you feel that there is something inside you being awakened right now, do not ignore it. Sometimes that's exactly how it all begins, simply, quietly, but profoundly real. If this made sense to you, write in the comments. Amen. What few people understand is that this silence where God speaks does not produce immediate, visible changes from one day to the next, because the transformation of the mind does not happen as an event, but as a profound, continuous, and carefully conducted process by God. And perhaps here is one of the greatest silent frustrations: the expectation of changing fast, of thinking differently overnight, of simply stopping certain thoughts. But that's not how God works. He doesn't erase the mind, he rebuilds. He doesn't ignore what you've experienced, he resignifies. Every old thought, every loaded memory, every belief that has been built over the years begins to be visited by God in this place of silence. And not aggressively, but with a precision that only he has. It is as if, little by little, what once seemed true began to lose strength, and something new, firmer, lighter began to occupy this space. Paul speaks of this in a straightforward way when he reveals that it is necessary to be renewed in the spirit of the mind. This means that there is a deeper layer than just superficial thoughts. There is an internal, invisible structure where your decisions, reactions, and emotions are formed, and it is exactly there that God begins to act. But realize something important: this process requires permanence. Because it is not a matter of listening once and already being transformed, but of returning to that place of silence again and again until the truth of God becomes stronger than any contrary thought. And it is at this point that many give up, because they do not see quick results, do not notice immediate changes, and end up returning to the same patterns. But even when you don't realize it, God is at work. He's dismantling thoughts that limit you. He's healing memories that still hurt. He's undermining lies you've believed for years. And all this happens silently, almost imperceptibly, but extremely powerful. There comes a time when you start to react differently without even realizing it. You start to feel peace where there was anxiety before. You start to have clarity where there was confusion before. And when that happens, you understand that it wasn't human effort, it was divine transformation. Ephesians 4:23, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind. If this word is awakening in you a sincere desire to live this transformation, then perhaps this is your time to stand before God in a simple but true way. Write in the comments, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears." And leave your like in this video, because this gesture can take this message to other people who also need to renew their minds and find peace. There is a detail in the life of Jesus that many read about but few really absorb, because at first glance it seems too simple to carry so much power. In the midst of crowds, miracles, teachings, and an intense routine, he did something that for many would not make sense. He walked away, not only out of physical necessity, but out of spiritual decision. He chose silence when everyone expected action. He chose solitude when everyone was looking for closeness. And it is exactly here that a secret begins to reveal itself, because the natural tendency is to believe that always being busy, always doing, always solving is a sign of strength and purpose. But Jesus shows otherwise. He would interrupt the rhythm, leave the middle of everyone, and enter a place where no one else could interfere. And this was not an escape. It was a strategy. It was in this quiet space that important decisions were aligned, the spirit was strengthened, and the direction became clear. How many times does the mind get confused precisely because it never stops? How many decisions are made in the impulse, in the fatigue, in the pressure of the moment, without this time of recollection? The absence of this silence creates a reactive life, where everything seems urgent, but nothing is really discerned in depth. And little by little, this wears out, gets tired, takes away clarity. Jesus understood that before speaking to the world, it was necessary to listen to the Father. Before acting, it was necessary to align. Before deciding, it was essential to remain silent. And this pattern reveals something powerful. Spiritual solitude does not isolate. It prepares. It does not weaken, it strengthens. It does not move away from the purpose, it reveals the purpose more precisely. And perhaps the most important point is this: it's not about amount of time, but about intention. Because you may even be physically alone, but with a mind full of noise. True retreat begins when everything within you slows down and surrenders to God's presence. It is there that thoughts begin to organize, that weights begin to fall, that answers begin to emerge effortlessly. Luke 5:16. But he withdrew into the wilderness and prayed. Perhaps now you realize that what was missing was not more effort, but more silence with purpose. And if this made sense to you in a simple and sincere way, write in the comments, "God is my direction." Sometimes a small sentence carries a big decision within it. There is a deep connection between what you think and what you feel, and often the restless mind is just the reflection of a soul that still carries wounds that have never been truly treated. They are old pains, words that marked, losses that were not understood, situations that remained unanswered. And even though time has passed, these marks continue to echo silently within you, influencing thoughts, emotions, and even decisions without you realizing it. Therefore, trying to calm the mind without taking care of the soul is like trying to silence an echo without treating the source of the sound. God doesn't just work on the surface, he goes deeper. And it is precisely in silence that he accesses these areas that no one else can reach. Places where human words do not reach, where explanations do not solve, where only his presence can touch. David understood this in a very intimate way. He didn't talk about controlling his mind forcefully, nor about ignoring what he felt. He described something much deeper, something almost impossible to explain logically. He said that he quieted his soul like a weaned child in his mother's arms. This does not speak of absence of pain, but of trust. It does not speak of perfection, but of rest. It is an image of someone who, even without understanding everything, decides to surrender to a place of safety. And perhaps that is exactly what is missing. because the wounded soul often lives in a state of alert, as if it needs to protect itself all the time. This generates racing thoughts, constant anxiety, difficulty trusting, and a feeling of restlessness that seems to have no end. But when you enter into that silence with God, something begins to change. Not forcefully, but naturally. It is as if, little by little, he was touching these sensitive areas, bringing healing where there was pain, bringing peace where there was agitation, bringing balance where everything seemed disorganized. And most importantly, no pressure, no charges, no weight. Just presence. Psalms 131:2. Surely I have behaved and been quiet as a weaned child. And when the soul begins to find that resting place, the mind follows. Thoughts slow down, emotions stabilize, and what once seemed impossible to control begins to align from the inside out. If you've made it this far, it may not be by chance. There is something being dealt with within you as you hear these words. And this is still just beginning. Stay until the end, because there is a prepared moment, a prayer that can mark a new beginning in your life, bringing strength, healing, and a peace that you may not have felt in a long time. There is a silent battle going on within the mind that often goes unnoticed, because not every thought that arises comes from God, and not everything that feels right really is. Without realizing it, the mind can become a confusing place where voices mix, emotions influence decisions, and impulses masquerade as direction. And it is exactly here that many are lost, not for lack of faith, but for lack of discernment. Because when there is no silence, everything seems to have the same weight, the same urgency, the same importance. A thought of fear may sound like prudence. Anxiety can feel like a warning. A doubt can disguise itself as reality. And little by little, the person begins to live reacting to what he feels, without being able to distinguish what really comes from God. Samuel experienced something very similar at the beginning of his journey. As a young man, he heard a voice calling, but he didn't recognize that it was God. He confused, hesitated, had no clarity, and this reveals something profound. Listening does not mean acknowledging. Many people even perceive something different, feel a touch, a direction, but cannot identify it with certainty. It was only when he was told to stand quietly and respond willingly that everything began to change. "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." This phrase is not just an answer, it is a posture. It is the moment when the mind stops trying to interpret everything on its own and decides to open up to hear clearly. And that's the turning point. Because God does not compete with noise. He speaks, but it takes a trained heart to recognize. And this training takes place in silence, in the constant practice of quieting the mind, of filtering thoughts, of not reacting immediately to everything that arises. Over time, something begins to happen. You come to notice when a thought brings peace and when it brings confusion. He learns to identify what edifies and what weakens. He develops a sensitivity that does not come from effort, but from living with God. And what once seemed confusing begins to become clear, simple, directed. For Samuel 3:10, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." If this message is opening your eyes to something you hadn't noticed yet, turn it into an attitude now. Declare in the comments, "Lord, I receive your teachings," write as an act of sincere surrender, and take the opportunity to leave your like, because this message can reach other people who also need to learn to listen to God's voice in the midst of chaos. There is a kind of silence that is not chosen but imposed by circumstances, moments when life seems to slow down by force, where doors close, answers do not come, and everything around seems emptier than usual. And it is exactly in these moments that many believe they are far from God, when in fact they may be entering one of the most powerful environments of spiritual transformation, the desert. The desert in the Bible was never just a physical place. It represents a process, a period where God works away from distractions, away from comfort, away from the voices that used to influence. It was in the wilderness that the people of Israel stopped thinking like slaves and began, albeit slowly, to learn to trust in God. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't easy, but it was necessary, because there are things inside the mind that are only revealed when the external noise subsides. In the desert, masks fall, distractions disappear, and what is hidden comes to the surface. Fears, doubts, insecurities, everything begins to appear more clearly. And this can be scary, it can bother you, but it is part of the purification process. Jesus also passed through the desert. Before he began something great, he was led to silence, to isolation, to direct confrontation with temptations that tried to divert his mind from the purpose. And there, without an audience, without applause, he won. This shows that the greatest victories do not happen in public, but in the quiet moments where internal decisions are made. The desert is not a place of abandonment, it is a place of preparation. It is where God removes wrong dependencies, strengthens faith, and teaches the mind to rest in Him, even when there are no visible signs. And maybe what you are experiencing today, this apparent silence, this feeling of being alone or without direction, is not the end, but a process. Deuteronomy 8:2. And you shall remember all the way in which the Lord your God led you in the wilderness. Because when you understand that, something changes inside you. You stop resisting and start learning. Stop questioning and start observing. Stop fighting the silence and start listening to what God is forming within you. And if this message has found space in your heart now, maybe it's because God is showing you that this moment has a greater purpose, and you can be part of something even bigger by taking that word forward. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because then this message can reach other people who are also passing through the desert and need to understand what God is doing. There is a point in the spiritual journey when everything around seems to ask for proof, clear signs, visible confirmations, but God chooses to work in a completely different way, almost contrary to human logic. Because true faith is not born from what the eyes see, but from what the heart learns to sustain in silence. And this is one of the biggest challenges, because living like this requires trusting when there are no apparent guarantees. Abraham was called to follow a path without maps, without detailed explanations, without human security. He heard a voice and decided to trust, even though he didn't fully understand. And this reveals something profound. Faith begins where control ends. It was not the noise of opinions, nor the validation of others that sustained his journey, but a silent conviction that was being built within him. And maybe what you're facing today is exactly that kind of moment, where everything seems uncertain, where the answers aren't clear, where the mind tries to look for logic in something that can only be understood by faith. And it is at this point that many retreat, because silence seems uncomfortable, it seems empty, it seems like the absence of direction. But in fact, it is exactly there that God is planting something stronger than any evidence. Because when the mind quiets down, it begins to move out of dependence on what it sees and into a deeper level of trust. It is no longer about understanding everything, but about trusting the one who is leading. And this change is subtle but powerful. Gradually, insecurity loses strength, doubt begins to weaken, and a quiet certainty begins to take up space. Hebrews defines this directly, saying that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. This means that there is an invisible foundation being built within you, something that sustains even when everything around you seems unstable. Hebrews 11:1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, and the longer you remain in that silence with God, the more that faith grows, not explosively but constantly, not based on emotions but on conviction. And there comes a time when you realize that you no longer need so many answers, because inside you there is already a security that does not depend on the outside. If while listening to this someone has come to your heart, perhaps it is not by chance. It may be that this person also needs that same strength, that same faith being released now. Write her name in the comments and put this life before God. Because when you do that, you join a chain of faith that goes beyond words and reaches what only God can transform. There is a decisive point in the spiritual journey where everything seems to be in motion, unstable, uncertain, as if life were a rough sea and the mind was in the middle of this storm trying not to sink. And it is exactly in this scenario that many discover something essential. It is not the absence of the storm that brings peace. It is the presence of God that sustains the mind in the midst of it. Peter lived it literally. He was surrounded by strong wind, rough waves, and a completely unfavorable scenery. But while his eyes were fixed on Jesus, he walked on that which was to sink him. This reveals a powerful principle that often goes unnoticed. The mind only remains steady when it is connected to the right presence. But the moment Peter looked away, everything changed. Fear entered, doubt took place, and what had previously seemed impossible to shake began to crumble. And this doesn't just happen in that story, it happens every day, silently. When the mind begins to focus more on the problems than on the presence of God, more on the circumstances than on the promise, it loses stability. And maybe that's exactly what you felt at some point. An internal change that did not come from outside, but from within. A thought that gained strength, a concern that grew, an insecurity that took space. Not because the situation has changed, but because the focus has changed. Therefore, keeping one's mind on God is not just a spiritual attitude. It is a necessity for those who want to live with peace. It does not mean ignoring reality, but choosing where to place attention, because what you feed inside you grows, gains strength, and begins to influence everything around you. Isaiah clearly reveals this when he says that God holds in peace the one whose mind is set on him. This does not speak of a fleeting peace, but of a continuous stability, something that remains even when everything around tries to destabilize. Isaiah 26:3. Thou shalt keep in peace him whose mind is set upon thee. And this steadfastness does not come from extreme effort, but from constant practice, to turn the thought to God even when the mind tries to get lost, to remember his presence even when circumstances seem higher, to choose over and over again to stay connected to what sustains. Over time, this connection becomes more natural. The mind learns to return, the heart learns to trust, and that which once shook begins to lose strength. Not because the challenges have disappeared, but because there is something stronger sustaining you inside. Nothing happens by chance. If you've made it this far, it's because this message might be just what you needed to hear today. Stay until the end, because there is something even deeper being prepared, and it may be the moment when your mind finally finds the peace it seeks. There is a moment in life when doubt does not come from a lack of options, but from an excess of them. Too many paths, too many voices, too many opinions, and the more you try to find an answer, the more confused the mind gets. It's like being in several directions at the same time, not knowing which one to follow, afraid of making mistakes, of choosing wrong, of getting lost along the way. And in this state, haste becomes dangerous, because important decisions begin to be made based on anxiety, not direction. But God does not work in confusion. He does not guide through despair, nor does he speak louder than the noise that the mind itself creates. Divine direction begins to become clear when something inside you slows down, when the heart quiets down, and when the need to control everything gives way to a willingness to listen. Joshua faced one of the most challenging moments of his life right at the beginning of his mission. He needed to take on a huge responsibility, to lead an entire people after the death of Moses against a backdrop of pressure, uncertainty, and expectation. Humanly, everything indicated confusion, insecurity, heaviness, but it was exactly at that moment that God spoke clearly. And this reveals a powerful principle. God's direction does not depend on a perfect environment, but on an aligned heart. While everything around may be unstable, the mind that stands silently before God begins to receive instructions with a precision that does not come from human logic. It's not about knowing everything at once, but about receiving the next step clearly. Because when the mind is agitated, any direction seems doubtful. But when she quiets down, even the most difficult path begins to make sense. God does not deliver complete maps. He delivers direction at the right time. And that requires trust. It requires surrender. It requires the courage to move forward, even without seeing everything. Silence, then, ceases to be just a place of rest and becomes a strategic environment, where decisions are formed, where paths are revealed, and where what seemed impossible begins to be clearly drawn. It is in this space that strategies that could not be thought of naturally begin to emerge, ideas that did not come from you, but that make sense in a profound way. Joshua 1:9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and be of good courage. Do not be afraid or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And as you learn to trust this process, something changes within you. The need to have all the answers decreases, and the security of being guided increases. The mind stops chasing after external certainties and begins to rest in the internal certainty that God is leading each step, even when the path is not yet completely visible. There are pains that do not appear on the face, are not said out loud, and are often not even understood by those around them. They are silent wounds, carried in the heart, which continue to echo in the mind, even when everything seems to be normal on the outside. And perhaps this is one of the most difficult experiences, because it is a pain that does not find space, does not find words, does not find explanation. It just remains there, occupying thoughts, stealing peace, and bringing a weight that is difficult to describe. And it is precisely in this invisible place that God begins to act in a deeper way. Because when no one sees, when no one understands, when there is no more strength to explain, there is still an open path, a meeting place where the soul can finally rest. Not through speeches, not through ready-made answers, but through presence. Anna experienced this kind of pain. She carried within her an affliction that could not be resolved with human words, and instead of trying to explain it to everyone, she did something different. She entered into silence and poured out her soul before God. His lips moved, but his voice was not heard. It was an intimate, deep, direct conversation with the Creator. And that reveals something that changes everything. God understands what you can't say. He sees what is hidden, hears what has not been spoken, and welcomes what no one else notices. In silence, there is no need for masks, nor for perfect explanations. There is only truth, and when that truth is laid before God, something begins to happen. The pain that seemed heavy begins to be relieved. The mind that was overloaded begins to find rest. Not because all situations changed immediately, but because something inside you was touched. 1 Samuel 1:13. For Hannah spoke in her heart, only his lips moved, but his voice was not heard. God does not reject a broken heart. On the contrary, it is precisely there that he draws even closer. And in that silence, where many see emptiness, he brings comfort, restoration, and a peace that cannot be explained, only lived. If that word has found something inside you that no one else sees, maybe it's God reaching out to you in a personal way now. And if this really touched your soul, write in the comments, "I trust in God." May this simple phrase be the beginning of something new happening inside you, even if still in silence. There is a silent difference between what people expect you to be and what God has really called you to be. And this difference is not discovered in the midst of applause, nor in the midst of opinions, nor in environments full of distractions. It is revealed in places where almost no one wants to be, in intimacy, in isolation, in silence where only you and God remain. Moses spent years living away from everything that was once part of his history. He wasn't in a position of prominence. He wasn't surrounded by recognition. He wasn't living something that to human eyes seemed important. He was tending sheep in a simple, repetitive, silent setting. And that's exactly where something extraordinary happened, because God did not choose the moment of visibility to reveal Moses' purpose. He chose the moment of anonymity. In the middle of the routine, in the middle of the silence, something caught his attention. A bush that burned but was not consumed. And the most important thing was not only what he saw, but the decision he made to stop, to get closer, to observe. This is the point where many pass right by, because God often manifests himself in subtle ways, in details, in signs that require attention, sensitivity, and a willingness to get out of the automatic. And when Moses came over, when he turned to that, God spoke. He called by name. It revealed something that would completely change the course of his life. Exodus 3:4. And when God saw the Lord turning thither, he cried out to him out of the midst of the bush, and said, "Moses, Moses." This shows that the call does not begin with a great mission. It begins with a willing heart. It begins with someone who, even in silence, is attentive, is sensitive, is willing to listen. Because the noise of distractions prevents many from perceiving what God has been trying to show for a long time. And perhaps what you're experiencing today seems too ordinary, too silent, even insignificant in your own eyes. But it is in this place that God forms, prepares, adjusts, and aligns. Before any exposure, there is an internal process. Before any recognition, there is a call that needs to be heard in secret. And when the mind learns to value that silence, something changes. You begin to realize that God doesn't need a stage to speak. He doesn't need crowds to confirm. He doesn't need perfect circumstances to reveal. He speaks where there is space, where there is attention, where there is surrender. If you are here now, it is no accident. There is something being awakened within you, something that you may not be able to explain yet, but you can feel. Stay until the end, because this journey is still revealing important parts that can change how you understand your own life and what God wants to do through it. There is a kind of silence that does not come from peace, but from the weight of a mistake, that moment when the mind goes back again and again to what has happened, trying to understand, trying to justify, trying to run away, but not being able to find rest. It is the silence after the fall, when words no longer work, when explanations lose meaning, and the heart is weighed down by a feeling that is difficult to ignore. Pedro got to know this place in a profound way. He failed no small way. He denied Jesus at the most critical moment, just when he should have stood firm. And after that, there was no speech, there was no justification, there was no defense. There was silence, a silence full of regret, conscience, pain. And perhaps this is exactly where many get lost, because they believe that error definitively distances them from God, that failure ends the purpose, that what happened defines who you are from then on. But God works in a different way. He doesn't ignore the mistake, but he also doesn't end the story because of it. What happens to Peter reveals something transformative. Jesus does not confront him in public, does not expose him, does not reject him. He calls Peter out on a date, an intimate, direct, profound moment. And there, In the silence of this conversation, something begins to be restored. Not just the relationship, but the identity. Jesus asks not to accuse, but to reconnect. He leads Pedro to revisit what really matters, not the mistake he made, but the love that still existed within him. And with each answer, something is reconstructed. The guilt begins to lose strength, the weight begins to leave, and in its place a new direction begins to emerge. John 21:17, feed my sheep. This shows that God doesn't just forgive, he repositions. He doesn't just clean up the past, he rebuilds the future. And all of this begins in the silence of true repentance, in that place where there are no more masks, where there are no more justifications, just a heart willing to start over. And maybe what you carry today, that memory, that mistake, that feeling of having failed is not the end. It may be just the point where God begins something new. Because when you enter into that silence with sincerity, he does not meet you with condemnation, but with restoration. And little by little, the mind that was stuck in the past begins to be renewed. The identity that seemed broken begins to be rebuilt. And what seemed to have ended begins to take on a new meaning. If this word spoke directly to something that you have lived or still carry within you, perhaps this is the time to recognize God's action even in the midst of failures. And if you feel it in your heart, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple word is the beginning of a deep restoration. There is a way for God to speak that does not draw attention to those who are distracted, not because he is silent, but because the mind is too busy to notice. Often the answer is already being shown, the path is already being indicated, but it goes unnoticed, like a detail ignored in the midst of excessive thoughts. And this raises an important question. How many times has God responded, but the mind was not quiet enough to recognize it? Gideon experienced exactly this internal conflict. He received a clear direction, but inside him there was still doubt, insecurity, a need for confirmation. And instead of ignoring it or feigning certainty, he did something that reveals a profound principle. He took his doubt to God. But it wasn't just any way, it was with reverence, with humility, trying to understand if it really came from the Lord. Judges 6:17. If I have now found favor in your sight, give me a sign that it is you speaking to me. And God answered, not with confusion, not with absolute silence, but with clear, specific signs, directed exactly to what Gideon needed at that moment. This shows that God is not angry with those who sincerely seek confirmation, but responds to those who approach with a willing heart. But there is one detail that makes all the difference. Gideon was attentive. He observed. He waited. He realized. And this was only possible because, even in the midst of doubt, there was space within him to listen and acknowledge. Because when the mind is full of noise, even the clearest signal can be ignored. Spiritual sensitivity is not born of extreme effort, but of inner stillness. That's when you start to slow down your thoughts, to not react immediately to everything, to create space to notice what was previously unnoticed, and little by little, something begins to change. You start noticing subtle directions, unexpected confirmations, details that seem small but carry meaning. It's not about living looking for signs all the time, but about living connected enough to recognize them when they appear. Because God keeps talking, keeps guiding, keeps responding, but not always in the way that the agitated mind expects. And when this sensitivity develops, insecurity begins to diminish. Doubt loses strength, not because all the answers were given at once, but because you learn to notice when God is confirming a path. And this brings a different peace, a security that does not depend on logic, but on spiritual perception. If this word is awakening something inside you, it's because maybe God has been trying to show you something for longer than you think. Stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed can open your eyes in an even deeper way, bringing a clarity that you may have been looking for a long time. There are times when life seems to lose its color, as if everything around it is collapsing at the same time, and the mind begins to be invaded by thoughts of discouragement, of loss, of the absence of a way out. It is as if hope was being erased little by little, not all at once, but in small layers, until there is almost nothing left. And the most difficult thing is that, in these moments, everything around seems to confirm this feeling. But there is a place where this logic does not hold, a place where hope does not depend on what is happening, but on who God is. And that place is not in the noise of opinions, nor in collective despair, nor in voices that reinforce fear. That place is in the silence, in the spiritual hiding place where the mind begins to be repositioned. Jeremiah lived in one of the most difficult scenarios possible. He saw destruction, loss, chaos all around him. Humanly, there was no reason to believe in anything good, but in the midst of it all, something happened inside him. He made a silent but powerful choice. He decided to remember. Not to remember the pain, not to remember the losses, but to remember God's faithfulness. And that decision changed everything, because when the mind turns to what God has already done, it begins to see beyond what is happening now. She comes out of momentary despair and connects with an eternal truth. Lamentations 3:22-23. The mercies of the Lord are the cause of our not being consumed, for his mercies have no end, new are every morning. This reveals that hope does not need to be created, it needs to be accessed. It already exists, but it is often hidden behind negative thoughts, difficult scenarios, emotions that try to dominate. And it is in silence that this hope begins to emerge again. Because when you step away from the noise, when you stop feeding thoughts that drain your strength, when you go into that secret place with God, something begins to be restored. Not necessarily around, but within you. And that changes the way you see everything. Hope returns, not as a fragile feeling, but as a tranquil certainty. A conviction that even if you don't see it now, God is still faithful. It is still present. He continues to act. And little by little, the mind that was tired begins to find rest. The heart that was heavy begins to relieve itself. And what seemed lost begins to take on a new meaning, not based on what is seen, but on what has never changed, the nature of God. There is something that begins in silence, but never ends in it. Because what God builds within an aligned mind inevitably begins to manifest itself around in relationships, in connections, in the way life is shared with other people. Silence does not isolate, it prepares. And when this process happens in a true way, its fruits become visible in the way you connect with others. The early church is a living example of this. They did not live only on words or rituals, but on a spiritual reality that had first been formed within each one. They were people who learned to listen to God, who experienced transformation in silence, and so when they were together, there was something different. There was unity, there was peace, there was a harmony that did not come from human effort, but from aligned hearts. Acts 2:42. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, and in fellowship, and in the breaking of bread, and in prayers. This shows that true communion does not begin on the outside, it begins within. Because when the mind is at peace, when the heart is aligned, when the spirit is sensitive to the presence of God, it is reflected in the way you treat, listen, and relate to others. Conflict decreases, understanding increases, patience grows, and perhaps most importantly, understand that God uses people to strengthen people. He did not call us to walk alone, but neither did he call us to depend on confused voices. There is a balance that is born when inner silence meets healthy communion. People who are seeking the same presence, who are being molded by the same God, who carry within themselves this silent transformation. When this happens, something powerful forms. A community where there is true support, where there is edification, where there is growth, not based on perfection but on alignment, because everyone is in process, but they are connected to the same source. And this type of environment is not built with external effort, but with internal transformation. The more people learn to be silent before God, the more the fellowship is strengthened, the more the presence is perceived, the more peace becomes real. And maybe you haven't even realized it yet, but the simple fact of being here, listening to this message, already connects you to something bigger, to other people who are also seeking, who are also being touched, who are also in the process of transformation. And if that word made sense to you, imagine how many other people also need to hear something like that today. You can be an instrument at this moment. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because this allows this message to reach more lives that are in need of direction, peace, and hope, just like you. There are times in life when God doesn't just speak to comfort, but to direct with urgency, like a call that can't be postponed, ignored, or put on for later. And in those moments, something inside you realizes that it's not just another ordinary thought, it's not just a passing idea, but a direction that carries weight, purpose, and responsibility. The problem is that even when that voice is clear, the mind is not always ready to obey. Jonah received a direct, blunt, unambiguous order. There was no confusion in the message. There was no lack of clarity. God said exactly what needed to be done, but still, Jonas chose to flee. And this reveals a conflict that often happens silently within any person, the struggle between what God asks for and what the human will desires. Because obeying is not always comfortable. Sometimes it means getting out of what is safe, facing the unknown, giving up personal preferences. And when the mind is not aligned, it begins to create justifications, begins to rationalize, begins to look for alternative paths that seem easier, but that, in fact, lead away from the right direction. And this is exactly where silence becomes essential, because an agitated mind tends to negotiate with the truth, tends to distort what it has heard, tends to convince itself that it can wait a little longer. But when the mind is quiet before God, something changes. Clarity increases, resistance decreases, and the willingness to obey begins to grow. Jonah 1:2. Get up, go to the great city of Nineveh and cry out against it. Ignoring God's voice does not nullify the call, it only prolongs the process. And often this brings consequences that would not be necessary if there was an immediate response, not as a punishment, but as a result of a misalignment. Because when you move away from direction, you also move away from the protection and peace that comes with it. But there is something important to understand. God keeps calling. Even when there is resistance, even when there is escape, His voice remains. And the more you learn to silence the mind, the more sensitive you become to noticing when that call happens. There are moments that do not come back, directions that need to be followed at the right time, decisions that define entire paths. And recognizing this does not generate fear, it generates awareness. Because when you understand the importance of listening and responding, you start to live in a more aligned, lighter, safer way. And deep down, the question that remains is not whether God is speaking, but whether the mind is quiet enough to listen and ready enough to obey when He calls. There is a battle that takes place before any visible result, a silent confrontation that no one sees, but that defines everything that comes after. Because before winning on the outside, it is necessary to win on the inside. And this is one of the most ignored truths, since many focus only on what is in front of their eyes, without realizing that the real decision happens in the mind. David entered a scenario where everyone was already defeated inside. The army was large, trained, prepared, but paralyzed. Not because they lacked strength, but because their minds had already accepted defeat before the battle even began. The giant not only dominated the field, he dominated the thoughts of everyone who watched him. But David did not carry that same mentality. He didn't just see the size of the problem, he saw who was with him, and that made all the difference. While everyone saw an impossible obstacle, he saw an opportunity to manifest God's power. And this vision did not emerge at that moment. It had already been built in silence, in previous experiences, in the way he learned to trust. Because external victory is only the reflection of an internal conviction. Before taking any step, David already knew who he was trusting, and that completely changed the way he positioned himself. He was not moved by fear, nor by doubt, nor by the pressure of the environment. He was moved by a silent certainty that was already established within him. 1 Samuel 17:45. You come to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. This statement was not impulsive. It was the result of an aligned mind. And when the mind is aligned with God, something powerful happens. Fear loses strength, insecurity decreases, and courage begins to grow naturally. Not because the situation has changed, but because the way of seeing has changed. And perhaps today there are giants before you, situations that seem greater than your capacity, challenges that seem impossible to overcome. But the most important question is not the size of what is in front of you, it is what is happening inside you. Because when the mind is transformed into silence with God, it ceases to react as before. He begins to think differently, to see differently, to position himself differently. And that's what paves the way to victory. If this word is confirming something inside you, don't let it go unnoticed. Sometimes, a simple statement can strengthen what God has already begun to build. Write in the comments, God takes care of me, and allow this truth to take hold even more within your heart. There is a deeper level of silence, where prayer ceases to be just repeated words and becomes spiritual positioning. A place where the mind is no longer focused only on itself, but begins to carry others before God. And this kind of intercession is not born in noise. It does not arise in haste. It does not develop in a distracted mind. It is born when everything within you quiets down enough to feel, perceive, and respond to what God is moving in the unseen. Daniel lived this intensely. He didn't just pray, he stood before God with discipline, with constancy, with a completely surrendered heart. And many times this happened in silence, away from any recognition, away from any human attention. But something extraordinary was happening in this hidden place, because while he was praying, even without seeing immediate answers, heaven was already in motion. There is a spiritual dimension that cannot be perceived by natural eyes, but that is activated when someone decides to remain in this place of intercession. And the most impressive thing is to understand that from the first moment Daniel took a stand, God had already heard. Daniel 10:12. Do not be afraid, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understanding and humbling yourself before your God, your words have been heard. This reveals something that completely changes the way we pray. Because many times the mind gets tired, gets discouraged, thinks that nothing is happening. But in silence, God is already at work, He's already moving, He's already responding, even if He's not yet visible. And that's exactly why intercession requires a transformed mind, a mind that doesn't rely on immediate signs to stay steadfast. To intercede is to carry someone in the heart before God. It is to remain even when there is no apparent answer. It is to trust that something is being done even when everything seems the same. And this level of surrender is only possible when the mind has already been trained in silence, when it has learned to trust without having to see. And the more you get into that place, the more sensitive you become. You begin to realize when to pray, who to pray for, how to position yourself, not by effort, but by connection. And little by little, you understand that you are not only living your own journey, but being used by God to touch the lives of others in a way that they may never be able to explain. This is one of the deepest levels of the transformation of the mind, when it ceases to be just a place of thoughts and becomes a spiritual channel, aligned with what God is doing beyond the visible. What you will hear now may be the exact answer God wants to give you, but many miss it by not remaining attentive to the end. Stay until the end, because what is yet to come may reveal something that will change the way you see your own connection with God. There is a kind of silence that tests faith in a profound way, because it is not just the absence of answers, but the feeling that nothing is happening. It is when prayers seem to have no return, when time passes and circumstances do not change, when the mind begins to question whether God is still listening. And it is exactly at this point that silent perseverance begins to be formed. Because it's easy to trust when everything is clear, when the answers come quickly, when the signs are visible. But when the scenario is one of waiting, when silence is prolonged, when there are no explanations, the mind comes into confrontation with itself. Thoughts arise, doubts appear, and the natural tendency is to weaken. Job lived this reality in an extreme way. He lost, suffered, questioned, and for a long time had no clear answers. God's silence did not mean absence, but it seemed so to human eyes. And in that process, something began to happen inside him. His faith stopped depending on circumstances and began to delve into something much greater. Because when there are no external answers, God begins to work internally. He begins to strengthen what cannot be shaken, begins to purify motivations, begins to reveal a dimension of trust that is not built in easy moments. And this does not happen visibly, but it is real. Quiet perseverance is born when you decide to stay, even though you don't understand, when you choose to keep trusting even without seeing, when you stand firm, not because of what's happening, but because of who God is. And that kind of faith doesn't waver easily because it's not backed by immediate results. Job reached a point where his perception changed completely. Before, he knew God from hearsay, from reports, from superficial understanding. But after going through this process, something changed. His experience became personal, profound, unshakable. Job 42:5. With the hearing of my ears I have heard, but now my eyes see you. This shows that silence is also a place of revelation, a place where God not only responds, but reveals himself in a more intimate way. And when this happens, the mind stops looking for only solutions and begins to value presence. Perhaps what seems to be absence is actually a process. Perhaps the silence that bothers you is the same silence that is strengthening you from within. Because God is not standing still, he is working in a dimension that cannot always be perceived immediately. And as you stay, something takes hold inside you, a more stable faith, a deeper trust, a peace that does not depend on quick answers. And when this process matures, you understand that you were never alone. You were just being prepared in silence for something greater. There is a common expectation that God will first change what is around, solve situations, open paths, transform scenarios. But the way he acts almost always starts from the inside out. Before any visible change, he works in the mind, in the heart, in the deepest intentions. And this can go unnoticed because many times the person continues to look outside, waiting for something to happen without realizing that the transformation has already begun internally. Zacchaeus lived a moment that illustrates this clearly. He did not first have a change of external life and then draw closer to Jesus. On the contrary, it was the meeting that changed everything. And this meeting was not noisy. It was not a great exhibition. It was something direct, personal, intimate. Jesus entered his house, and there, in that space, something began to happen. There was no imposition. There was no accusation. There was no list of demands. There was presence, and this presence was enough to generate a transformation that no external pressure could produce. Because when God touches the mind in silence, he does not force changes, he generates convictions. And that's exactly what happened to Zacchaeus. Something inside him changed so profoundly that his attitudes began to reflect it immediately. He was not convinced by human arguments, he was transformed by a real experience. And this transformation became visible in his decisions, in his choices, in the way he started to act. Luke 19:8. Behold, I give to the poor half of my possessions, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. This shows that when God transforms the inside, the outside naturally follows. It's not effort, it's not obligation, it's a result. The mind begins to think differently, the heart begins to feel differently, and life begins to follow a new path. And maybe you're expecting changes around you, visible answers, external solutions, without realizing that God has already started something inside of you. Small changes in thinking, new perceptions, a different discomfort with things that once seemed normal. These are all signs that something is being aligned. Silence with God creates this space where these convictions are born. And when they are born, they cannot be ignored. They begin to direct, to adjust, to transform constantly. And the longer you stay in that place, the more this transformation is strengthened. And there comes a point when what is inside you no longer allows you to live as before. If at this moment there is something inside you that needs to be surrendered, placed before God, do not keep it just for yourself. Write in the comments your prayer request, what is in your heart, what you feel needs divine intervention. Because when you express this, you are not alone. You connect with a current of faith that can strengthen you and achieve what only God can transform. There is something that sustains the mind when everything around it seems unstable, a kind of invisible steadfastness that does not depend on what is happening at the moment, but on what has been established by God. And this firmness is not born automatically. It is built when the mind learns to hold on to promises, even when reality seems to say otherwise. Because the truth is that there are times when everything challenges faith. Situations that don't seem to move forward, responses that take time, scenarios that seem impossible to change. And it is precisely in these moments that the mind begins to oscillate, going from a thought of hope to another of doubt, creating a cycle of instability that is difficult to control. Sarah experienced this conflict in a very real way. She received a promise that, to human eyes, seemed impossible. Time passed, circumstances did not help, and logic said that it could not happen. And even so, God did not go back on what he said. This shows that the promise never depended on the surrounding conditions, but on the faithfulness of the promiser. And this is where silence becomes essential. Because away from the noise of opinions, away from the voices that reinforce the impossible, the mind begins to reposition itself. He stops relying only on what he sees and begins to stand on what God has declared. And this process does not happen all at once. It is built gradually, in repetition, in constancy, in the daily choice to trust. Hebrews 10:23. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope, for he who promised is faithful. To hold firm means not to let go, not to abandon, not to let circumstances steal what has been planted within you. And this requires a mind trained in silence, a mind that has already learned to filter thoughts, not to be carried away by any momentary sensation. Because when the promise becomes the anchor, the mind ceases to be carried away by the waves of doubt. She may feel the impact of circumstances, but she does not get lost in them. There is an inner stability that sustains, that holds firm, that prevents everything from collapsing inside. And over time, something begins to change. Anxiety decreases, the need for immediate answers loses strength, and a deeper trust begins to take place. Not based on what is happening now, but on the certainty that God does not fail. And perhaps what you are experiencing today is exactly this interval between promise and fulfillment. A time that seems silent, but is actually strengthening your mind, aligning your faith, and preparing you to sustain what God has already declared. There is a level of protection that does not come from avoiding problems, but from knowing how to recognize what should not be followed. Because not everything that seems good comes from God, and not everything that seems urgent needs to be answered. And when the mind is not trained, it becomes vulnerable, easily influenced by emotions, pressures, and even distractions that seem harmless but completely divert the path. Spiritual discernment is born exactly at this point. It is not just knowing what is right or wrong in a basic way, but perceiving what is aligned with God and what, even though it is apparently good, is not part of the purpose. And this requires a sensitivity that does not develop in noise, but in silence. Solomon understood this in a way that few did. Faced with the opportunity to ask for anything, he chose no wealth, no power, no recognition. He asked for discernment. He asked for a heart capable of understanding, of judging wisely, of seeing beyond appearances. This reveals that the greatest protection for the mind is not in external control, but in internal clarity. 1 Kings 3:9. Give your servant a heart understanding to judge your people. And this clarity does not arise automatically. It is built when the mind learns to slow down, not to react impulsively, not to accept everything as truth just because it seems convincing. In silence with God, something begins to be trained. You start to notice nuances, to feel when something isn't right, even if you can't explain it right away. And this avoids many unnecessary paths. Avoid hasty decisions, avoid regrets, avoid getting into situations that could be avoided. Because discernment works like a filter, separating what edifies from what only distracts. Over time, this perception becomes stronger. You start to hear less the impulse and more the direction. It begins to depend less on immediate logic and more on spiritual sensitivity. And this brings a different security, not based on control, but on alignment. Because a transformed mind is not only one that thinks differently, but one that sees differently. Who perceives before, who understands before, who avoids before. And perhaps what God is developing in you now is not just an answer, but discernment not to enter paths that were not prepared for you. Because often, the greatest blessing is not what happens, but what is avoided. If that word made sense deep in your soul, recognize it as something bigger than coincidence. There is a purpose being revealed here. And if you feel that, write in the comments, God chose me. Because this awareness can change the way you see each decision from now on. There are times when everything around seems unstable, as if the ground is moving, as if there is no security in anything that once seemed firm. And in those moments, the mind automatically tries to find a place of protection, something that it can lean on, something that brings stability. But when this search happens only abroad, the result is almost always frustration, because circumstances change, situations vary, and what seemed safe can disappear from one moment to the next. This is exactly why God's presence becomes more than a spiritual concept. It becomes a real refuge for the mind. A place where, regardless of what is happening outside, there is a security that cannot be shaken. And this refuge is not accessed in despair, but in silence, in the constant connection that is being built little by little. David lived surrounded by threats, persecutions, moments of real risk. He had concrete reasons to be afraid, to live in constant tension, to let his mind be dominated by insecurity. But something inside him was different. He did not deny reality, but neither did he allow it to define his inner state, because while many would seek security in strategies, people, or favorable circumstances, David chose something deeper. He anchored himself in the presence of God, and that choice completely changed the way his mind reacted to what was around him. Psalm 27:1. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? This statement was not born in a moment of tranquility. It was born in the midst of pressure. And this shows that true peace does not depend on the absence of problems, but on the right presence within you. When the mind is connected to God, it finds a safe place, even when everything seems uncertain. And this place doesn't eliminate challenges, but it changes how you face them. Fear may even try to arise, but it does not find room to remain. Anxiety may try to get closer, but it doesn't dominate, because there is something stronger sustaining inside. Silence with God strengthens this connection. It creates a space where the mind stops reacting automatically and begins to rest. And the longer you stay in that place, the more that security becomes natural. Not as something you need to seek all the time, but as something that is already established within you. And little by little, what once shook begins to lose strength. Situations that once took away your peace no longer have the same effect, because the mind has found a refuge that does not depend on what is outside, but on who is inside. Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time, something that solves what's around you. But there's something even deeper going on here. Stay until the end, because what is being revealed can transform not only your circumstances, but the way your mind reacts to everything you experience. There is a profound difference between listening and really listening, because listening can be something quick, superficial, almost automatic, but listening requires attention, requires presence, requires silence. And when it comes to God's voice, that difference becomes decisive. Many even listen, but few listen deeply enough to obey without resistance, because true obedience is not born of a piece of information received, but of a conviction formed within. And this conviction is only built when the mind is quiet enough to absorb, reflect, and align. Without it, any direction can seem confusing, exaggerated, or even impossible to follow. Noah received an instruction that, to human eyes, made no sense at all. Building an ark in a setting where there were no visible signs of what was to come required something other than logic. It required deep listening, a trust that did not depend on external confirmation. And the most impressive thing was not just what he heard, but how he responded. Genesis 6:22. Thus did Noah, according to all that God commanded him, he did so. This phrase carries a level of alignment that goes beyond simple obedience. There was no negotiation. There was no adaptation. There was no attempt to adjust God's direction to his own understanding. He listened, understood, and responded. And this was only possible because his mind was positioned differently. Because when the mind is full of noise, it questions too much, resists too much, tries to adapt everything to its own logic. But when she learns to be silent before God, something changes. Resistance decreases, clarity increases, and trust begins to become stronger than doubt. And that doesn't mean that everything will be easy or understandable at first. Often, God's leading challenges what you're used to requires steps that seem uncertain. But this is exactly where deep listening makes a difference, because it is no longer a matter of understanding everything, but of trusting the one who is speaking. And the more you practice this silence, the more sensitive you become. You begin to notice when God is directing, when He is adjusting, when He is asking for something specific, and obedience ceases to be a burden and becomes a natural response of an aligned heart. Because deep down, obeying is not losing control, it is entering a path where God has already prepared what you cannot yet see. And when the mind understands this, it stops resisting and starts walking more lightly, even without having all the answers. And maybe today, God has already spoken something to your heart, something that you are still processing, maybe even questioning. But this message came to you for a reason. If this is making sense now, if you feel that God is directing you in some way, don't let it slide. Subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications and stay on the lookout, because there are more words like this that can keep aligning your mind and strengthening your walk. There are times when everything you see contradicts what you believe, as if reality is saying the exact opposite of the promise. It is in these moments that faith ceases to be a comfortable idea and becomes a profound decision. Because while everything seems to point to fear, to retreat, to giving up, something inside you needs to choose to stand firm. Daniel lived one of these moments intensely. He was not faced with a common difficulty, but with a real, concrete threat, impossible to ignore. The lion's den was not symbolic, it was literal. It was the kind of situation where anyone would be overwhelmed by fear, where human logic would say that there is no way out. And yet, something inside him was not shaken. The most impressive thing was not only the deliverance that came after, but the posture he maintained before. Daniel did not change his routine, did not negotiate his faith, did not adjust his posture to avoid the problem. He remained. And this permanence reveals a mind that had already been worked in silence, a mind that was already aligned with God even before the crisis arrived. Because true faith is not built at the moment of pressure, it is revealed there. It has been formed before in quiet moments, in daily decisions, in the constancy of a life connected with God. And when the extreme situation arrives, this faith manifests itself. Daniel 6:23, no harm was found in him because he had believed in his God. That confidence was not impulsive, it was not emotional, it was not based on favorable circumstances. It was a firm, deep-rooted conviction built over time. And that is exactly what silence with God produces. A faith that does not depend on what is happening around us, but on the certainty of who God is. And maybe today you are facing something that seems impossible, a situation that challenges your peace, that tries to shake your confidence, that makes your mind question if there really is a way out. But the deeper question is not about what is before you, it is about what is being held within you. Because when the mind is aligned with God, it doesn't easily bow to fear. She may even recognize the difficulty, but she does not surrender to it. There is a silent force that keeps you steady, a trust that cannot be explained, but sustained. And it is in this kind of faith that the impossible begins to lose strength. Not because the situation changed immediately, but because you didn't change in the face of it. Because you remain. Because you trust. Because you choose not to bend, even when everything around you seems to demand it. And it is at this point that something begins to move, not only around you but within you, strengthening, aligning, and preparing for what is yet to come. There are times when fatigue is not only physical, it is something deeper, quieter, as if the mind is overloaded with so many battles, so many decisions, so many accumulated thoughts. It is an exhaustion that cannot be solved only with common rest, because it reaches the interior, weakens motivation, decreases clarity, and little by little begins to affect even faith. And the most difficult thing is that this fatigue often appears after great achievements, after intense moments, after periods where you needed to be strong. That is exactly what happened to Elias. He had lived powerful experiences, seen God's action in a supernatural way, but soon after he found himself exhausted, emotionally shaken, just wanting to stop. This reveals something important. Even the strongest go through moments of exhaustion, and God is not ignorant of this. It doesn't require you to continue at the same pace. It doesn't demand performance when the soul is tired. On the contrary, he leads to a place of restoration. And this place is not full of noise, it is not accelerated, it is not pressured. It is in silence that recovery begins. Elijah was led to stop, to rest, to be cared for. Before any new mission, before any new direction, God dealt with the inside of him. It fed, strengthened, brought balance again. Isaiah 40:31. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and shall not be weary. They will walk and will not faint. To wait on God is not to stand by meaninglessly. It is to stand in a place where strength is restored from the inside out. It's allowing silence to be a healing environment, where the mind slows down, where emotions reorganize, where the weight begins to lift. Because continuing without renewal is dangerous. The tired mind loses discernment, makes hasty decisions, becomes more vulnerable. But when you learn to stop in the presence of God, something begins to be redone. The force returns, not as before, but deeper, more stable. And little by little, what seemed heavy begins to become light again. Clarity returns, hope is strengthened, and the willingness to continue comes naturally, not out of obligation, but because you were restored. And maybe that's exactly what you need right now. No more effort, but renewal. No longer haste, but silence. No longer try to stay on the edge, but allow God to strengthen what is weakened within you. Few people will understand this message, but if you are here, it is because God wants to speak directly to you. Open your heart and stay until the end, because there is still something deeper being revealed that can completely transform how you move forward, going forward. There is a moment in life when everything starts to make sense in a different way, as if pieces that once seemed disconnected start to fall into place. But this understanding is not born in the midst of haste, nor in the attempt to control every detail. It arises when the heart becomes available, when the mind quiets down enough to realize that God not only watches its history, but conducts it with intention. Because purpose is not something that is discovered just by looking ahead. It is often understood when you look carefully at where you are right now. Esther didn't start her journey understanding the impact it would have. It was positioned, prepared, led by circumstances that at first glance seemed just ordinary events. But there was something bigger being built, and there came a time when she needed to recognize that, not as a distant idea, but as a real responsibility. A call that required courage, that required decision, that required giving up comfort to accomplish something greater than itself. And this clarity did not come from external noise, but from an internal perception that can only be accessed when there is silence. Esther 4:14. And who knoweth whether thou hast come to this kingdom for such a time as this? This question carries a depth that crosses time, because she doesn't just talk about Esther's past, she talks about the present of anyone who begins to realize that they are not where they are by chance. There is a purpose, there is a reason, there is a strategic positioning that is often only revealed when the mind stops resisting and starts listening. Silence with God opens up this understanding. It allows you to see beyond the circumstances, beyond the apparent limitations, beyond the fears that try to prevent advancement. And little by little, what seemed like just another moment in life begins to gain meaning. But recognizing the purpose also requires a response. Because it is not enough to understand, it is necessary to act. And this is the point where many retreat, because fulfilling the purpose may require renunciation, may require stepping out of one's comfort zone, may require trust in something that is not yet completely visible. And yet, when the mind is aligned, the answer begins to emerge more clearly, not as a pressure, but as a conviction. You begin to realize that you have been prepared, that you have been placed exactly where you need to be, that there is something that only you can do within this scenario. And it is at this moment that the purpose ceases to be an idea and becomes a path. A path that does not depend on applause, does not depend on recognition, but on alignment with what God has already established. And the longer you remain in that silence, the more that understanding is strengthened. The more doubt loses space, the more courage grows, the more the willingness to fulfill what has been entrusted to you becomes real. There are times when the mind becomes a real battlefield, thoughts that contradict each other, decisions that seem impossible, paths that divide without showing which one is right. And the more you try to solve it with logic alone, the more confusing everything gets. It is as if each attempt to find clarity generates even more doubts, creating a cycle that is difficult to break. And it is exactly in this scenario that the voice of God becomes indispensable. Because there is a clarity that does not come from human reasoning, does not come from calculations, does not come from opinions. It comes from a meeting. A moment where everything that is shuffled within you is interrupted by a truth that leaves no room for confusion. Paul was completely convinced that he was on the right track. His mind was full of certainties, justifications, arguments that made sense to him. And yet he was completely out of line with God's purpose. This shows that human conviction is not always synonymous with truth. But on the way to Damascus, something happened that changed everything. It was not a slow process, it was not a gradual construction, it was a direct encounter, an interruption, a voice that crossed everything he thought and established a new reality. Acts 9:4. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? This question was not just a speech, it was a breaking point. In an instant, Paul's entire mental structure began to be deconstructed. What he believed, what he stood for, what guided his decisions, everything was confronted by a greater truth. And that's how God often acts. He doesn't just organize thoughts, he redefines paths. He doesn't just clear up doubts, he transforms the direction. And that only happens when there is space to listen, when the mind quiets down enough to allow that voice to enter. Because while there is internal noise, resistance, pride, or excess control, that clarity is not fully established. But when silence is practiced, when there is a willingness to really listen, something changes. The confusion begins to dissipate, priorities align, and a new direction begins to emerge steadily. And maybe you're right at that point right now. With mixed thoughts, difficult decisions, not knowing which way to go. But what is missing is not more information, it is a meeting. It's listening to the right voice at the right time. Because when God speaks, he leaves no doubt. It may even challenge, it may even require changes, but it brings a clarity that nothing else can bring. And when that clarity comes, the mind is never the same again. He starts to see differently, to decide differently, to walk with a security that no longer depends on all answers, but on the certainty of the one who is guiding. If this message is bringing light to something that was once confused within you, don't ignore this moment. Write in the comments, I trust in God's action, and allow this truth to take hold even more within your mind and heart. There is a moment when transformation ceases to be something just internal and begins to become visible, perceptible, undeniable. Because what God does in silence was not made to remain hidden, but to manifest itself so clearly that other people can see, feel, and recognize that something real has happened. A mind that has been touched by God does not remain the same, and that change, even without words, begins to speak for itself. The Gadarene man is a living portrait of this. Before, his life was marked by confusion, pain, lack of control, a mind dominated by forces that took him away from himself and from any possibility of peace. He lived isolated, lost, without direction. But everything changed after an encounter. A single moment with Jesus was enough to completely reorganize what seemed impossible to restore. And the most interesting thing is that, after that, Jesus did not call him to hide, nor to keep that experience to himself. He sent it. He told him to return to his home, to his environment, to the people who knew his story, and to show what God had done. Mark 5:19. Go to your house, to your own, and tell them how great things the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you. This reveals something profound. True transformation becomes testimony, not as an obligation, but as a natural consequence. Because when God changes the mind, he changes the way he lives, he changes the way he speaks, he changes the way he reacts, and the people around start to notice. Silence with God is not just a personal refuge, it is a process that generates impact. It is where healing begins, but also where testimony is born. Because what has been dealt with in secret takes shape in the public, not for human exaltation, but to reveal the action of God. And perhaps the most powerful thing is to understand that you don't need elaborate words to testify. Your life, your attitudes, your peace in the midst of difficult situations, all of this becomes evidence that something different is happening. And it reaches people in a way that no explanation could. When God rearranges the inside, he turns on a light that cannot be hidden, and this light begins to illuminate other paths, other lives, other stories, people who might never hear a message, but who can see a transformation. And this is how the invisible becomes visible, not by imposition, but by demonstration, not by effort, but by evidence. Because a mind transformed in silence carries within itself a living proof that God continues to act, continues to restore, continues to change stories from the inside out. There are prisons that cannot be seen but are felt every day, thoughts that repeat themselves like an endless cycle, internal voices that accuse, memories that hurt, ideas that limit and steal peace in a silent way. And the most difficult thing is that many times these prisons seem normal, as if they were just part of the way of thinking, when in fact they are chains that keep the mind trapped. These oppressive thoughts don't come out of nowhere. They feed on past experiences, words that have marked, situations that have not been resolved, and they create an internal structure that distorts the way you see yourself, how you see the world, and even how you see God. And without realizing it, the mind begins to accept this as truth. But Jesus, throughout his ministry, showed something different. He didn't just heal physical ailments. He freed minds. People who were imprisoned, oppressed, dominated by forces they could not control, found in him a freedom that went beyond what was visible. Because true liberation begins within. And it is in silence before God that these prisons begin to be exposed. Because as long as there is distraction, as long as there is noise, these voices continue to act without being confronted. But when the mind becomes still, when you stand in the presence of God, something starts to surface. Thoughts that previously went unnoticed begin to be perceived, lies begin to be identified. And that's when the truth comes in, not as an idea, but as an authority. God's truth doesn't just confront, it breaks. It undoes what was built in the wrong way. It replaces what was a lie with something solid, firm, real. John 8:36. If the sun sets you free, you will be free indeed. This freedom is not superficial, it is not temporary, it is profound, spiritual, definitive. Because when the mind yields to the truth of Christ, it ceases to be dominated by that which once controlled it. Thoughts begin to lose strength, accusations cease to have authority, the weight begins to leave, and little by little something new begins to take hold, a clarity that did not exist before, a lightness that seemed distant, a peace that does not depend on circumstances. And this change does not come from human effort, but from surrender, to allow God to have access, to allow Him to touch, to transform. Because the mind that was once a place of conflict begins to become a place of rest. What imprisoned begins to be replaced by what liberates, and what once seemed impossible to change begins to transform in a real, consistent, continuous way. And in this process, you begin to realize that true freedom is not doing everything you want, but living without what held you back, without what limited you, without what stole your peace. A freedom that is born in silence, but that transforms the whole way of living. There is a depth in God that cannot be accessed by a rushing mind, nor by a distracted heart. It is a level of revelation that is not found on the surface. It is not discovered in a hurry. It is not achieved only with curiosity. It demands permanence, it demands silence, it demands a true willingness to stand before God without haste to leave, without anxiety for quick answers. Because the mysteries of God are not hidden by Him, they are protected from noise. They are available, but they are only perceived by those who learn to stay. And this is a point that many do not understand, because they want immediate answers. They want clarity without process. They want depth without intimacy. João experienced something that reveals exactly that. Isolated on the island of Patmos, removed from everything, without distractions, without outside influence, he entered a level of connection that opened deep spiritual doors. What seemed like a place of isolation became an environment of revelation. And this was not a coincidence, it was positioning. Because when everything around you falls silent, the mind begins to notice what previously went unnoticed. God's presence becomes clearer, His voice clearer, and what seemed distant begins to draw nearer. Not because God has changed, but because the mind has finally created space. Jeremiah 33:3. Cry unto me, and I will answer thee, and show unto thee great and mighty things which thou knowest not. This promise does not only speak of response, it speaks of revelation. Big, firm things that cannot be achieved by human understanding alone. And this only happens in an environment of intimacy, a place where there is no hurry, where there is no distraction, where there is only a heart willing to listen. And the more you enter this place, the more you realize that there is much more than what you have ever known. A spiritual dimension that is not explained but experienced. A clarity that does not come from outside but from within. A perception that changes the way you see everything. Because God doesn't reveal His secrets to impress, but to align, to show paths, to strengthen faith, to deepen connection. And this revelation is not something distant, it is available, but it requires posture. It requires silence. It requires presence. And perhaps what is missing is not more search, but more permanence. No more questions, but more willingness to listen. Because when you position yourself in that place, something starts to open up. And what once seemed hidden begins to be revealed in a clear, direct, transformative way. Over the next few minutes, something even deeper begins to be revealed, and it may be just what you needed to understand what God is doing in your life right now. Stay aware, because it can change how you connect with Him starting today. There is a kind of peace that cannot be explained, because it does not follow the logic of what is happening around it. It is a tranquility that remains even when everything seems out of place. A stability that does not depend on answers, nor on immediate solutions. And precisely for this reason, it becomes so incomprehensible to the natural mind. Because normally, peace is associated with favorable circumstances. When all is well, the mind calms down. When problems disappear, the heart rests. But the peace that comes from God doesn't work that way. She does not wait for the scenario to change to manifest itself. She appears in the midst of chaos and remains there, firm, sustaining what could collapse. Paul is one of the greatest proofs of this. Trapped, limited, living a reality that could easily generate despair, he wrote about joy, about trust, about peace. This doesn't make sense to those who observe from the outside, but it reveals something powerful to those who understand it from the inside. The source of this peace was not in circumstances, it was in connection, and this connection was nurtured in silence, not an empty silence, but a silence filled with the presence of God, a place where the mind was not dominated by what was happening, but guarded by something greater. Because when you enter that space, something starts to happen in a subtle but profound way. Thoughts slow down, anxiety loses strength, fear ceases to dominate. Not because you ignored reality, but because you found something stronger than it. And that strength doesn't come from you, it comes from God working within you. Philippians 4:7. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. This peace guards. It protects the mind, prevents destructive thoughts from taking over, blocks what tries to generate despair. It is like an invisible shield that keeps the inside stable, even when the outside is in conflict. And the most impressive thing is that this peace does not need to be conquered with extreme effort. It is received when you take a stand. When you enter into that silence with God, when you surrender what is heavy, when you decide not to carry alone what was not made for you to bear. Over time, that peace begins to become a part of you, not as something occasional, but as a constant presence. And what once shook you begins to lose power. Situations that used to take away your tranquility no longer have the same effect. Because the mind has found a safe place, not in quick answers, not in immediate solutions, but in the presence of God who sustains, guards, and strengthens from the inside out. There is a level of spiritual life where a person stops just reacting to what happens and begins to influence the environment around him, not by human force, but by spiritual authority. And this authority is not something immediately visible. It is not built with words or appearance, but it is born within, in the silence where the mind aligns completely with God. Because when the mind is misaligned, it becomes unstable, easily affected by fear, doubt, and insecurity. But when it is transformed, when it goes through the process of silence, surrender, and renewal, something begins to change. The person no longer positions himself in the same way, does not react in the same way, does not allow himself to be easily dominated. The disciples are a clear example of this. At first, they were insecure, full of doubts, often not understanding what Jesus was teaching. But as they walked with him, as they learned and listened and lived through this transformation, something began to build within them. And then it became visible. They began to act boldly, with firmness, with a confidence that did not come from themselves. It wasn't arrogance, it was authority, an authority that came from an aligned mind, from a connected heart, from a life that had been shaped in silence with God. Luke 10:19. Behold, I give you power to tread on serpents and scorpions and all the strength of the enemy, and nothing will hurt you. This power is not just about confronting evil, but about not being dominated by it. It's about walking with a security that doesn't depend on circumstances. It's about standing firm even when there's pressure. It's about knowing who you are in God. And this authority is not built in moments of exposure. It is formed in invisible moments. In the silence where no one sees, where there is no recognition, where there is no applause. It is there that the mind is trained, that character is formed, that the connection with God is strengthened. And when this is established, the impact is inevitable. Environments begin to change, decisions become firmer, words carry more weight. Not because the person has changed externally first, but because something inside them has been completely transformed. The aligned mind does not get carried away by any situation. She discerns, she stands, she moves forward with confidence. And that trust is not based on control, but on spiritual authority. And maybe what God is doing in you right now is not just giving you peace or direction, but preparing you to walk at that level, where you not only survive the circumstances, but stand above them with firmness, clarity, and an authority that is born in silence and manifests in every step. There is a level of confidence that is only developed when the mind learns to rest on something it cannot control. Because trusting God when everything is clear is natural, but trusting when the paths seem confusing, when the answers do not come, when reality seems to contradict the promise, requires a profound transformation from within. Jose lived exactly this process. His story was not marked by quick answers, but by long periods of silence, of waiting, of situations that to human eyes seemed unfair and meaningless. He was betrayed, sold, forgotten. And at each stage there was room for doubt, for questioning, for discouragement, but something inside him remained steadfast. Even though he didn't fully understand what was happening, he didn't lose connection with God. And this reveals a type of trust that goes beyond circumstances. It is not a trust based on what one sees, but on what one knows about who God is. Because when the mind is transformed into silence, it learns not to depend on immediate explanations. She begins to accept that not everything will be understood at the moment, but it can still be trusted. And this confidence completely changes the way we live. Genesis 50:20. You meant evil against me, but God intended it for good, to do as it is this day, to keep many people alive. This statement was not made in the middle of the process, it was made later. And this shows that there are things that only make sense when seen from another point. But to reach this understanding, Joseph had to stay. He had to trust even when everything seemed otherwise. And this is exactly what silence with God strengthens. It creates within you a stability that does not depend on immediate responses. He teaches the mind to rest, even when it does not understand, to remain, even when it sees no way out. Because God's sovereignty does not fail, even when the paths seem disorganized, even when situations seem out of control, He continues to work. And this operation is not always visible, but it is real. And when the mind understands that, something changes profoundly. Anxiety decreases, the need for control loses strength, and a more mature confidence begins to be established. Not as a passing feeling, but as a solid conviction. You begin to realize that you don't have to understand everything to trust. You don't need to have all the answers to continue. There's a safety in knowing that God is leading, even when you can't see the full way. And this confidence does not paralyze you, it sustains you. It keeps you firm in the midst of uncertainties, gives you the strength to continue, and prepares you to understand, at the right time, what still seems confusing today. By the end of this video, you'll feel something different, something you may not be able to explain, but that will touch deep within you. Stay until the end, because what is being built here can completely transform the way you see everything you are experiencing now. There is a joy that the world cannot explain, because it does not depend on events, achievements, or perfect moments. It is a joy that is born in a deeper place, in the interior, where the presence of God begins to occupy spaces that were previously dominated by worry, emptiness, or restlessness. And when that joy begins to emerge, something changes in a quiet but real way, because normally joy is treated as something fleeting, a feeling that comes and goes, which depends on good news, favorable situations, specific moments. But what God generates does not follow this pattern. It is not superficial, it is not fragile, it does not disappear when circumstances change. Maria experienced this in a unique way. By understanding God's action in her life, even in the face of a scenario that could generate fear, insecurity, or doubt, she expressed a joy that did not make sense to those who looked from the outside. It was a joy that came from the certainty that God was present, that He was leading, that there was a greater purpose being fulfilled. And this joy was not born in the noise, nor in the logical explanation of the facts. She was born in communion, in silent connection with God, where the mind aligns and the heart finds rest. Because when you enter that place, something starts to be filled from the inside out. Psalm 16:11. In your presence there is an abundance of joy. At your right hand there are pleasures forever. This word reveals that joy is not scarce, it is abundant in the presence of God. And this completely changes the way of searching, because it is no longer a question of looking outside for what can only be found within. It is not a matter of waiting for everything to be perfect in order to feel peace, but of remaining in the presence that generates that peace regardless of the scenario. And the longer you remain in that silence with God, the more that joy becomes constant. Not as an intense emotion all the time, but as a continuous lightness, an inner satisfaction, a tranquility that accompanies you even on difficult days. The mind begins to rest, the heart calms down, and what once seemed heavy begins to lose strength. Because there is something bigger occupying this space now, a presence that sustains, that fills, that transforms, and maybe what you're looking for outside is already available inside, just waiting for a different positioning, a moment of silence, a decision to stay. Because when you access that presence, everything changes, not necessarily around, but within you. And this internal change begins to reflect on everything, in the way you see life, how you react to situations, how you face challenges. Joy ceases to be a moment and becomes a state. Nothing in this life happens without a purpose. If that word has found something within you right now, take it as a sign. And if you feel that, write in the comments, "I believe, Lord." Because sometimes a simple statement makes room for something new to start within you. What has been revealed so far shows that this peace and joy are not distant. They are available now, accessible to those who decide to stop and stand before God in silence and truth. It is no longer just about understanding, but about living, about experiencing that presence that transforms the mind from the inside out and fills every empty space with something eternal. As it is written in Matthew 6:6, "But when you pray, go into your closet, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you publicly." That is the invitation that is before you at this moment. Not a religious invitation, but a personal, intimate, direct call to His heart. A time where you can put aside everything that is heavy, everything that is confusing, everything that has occupied your mind, and simply place yourself before God with sincerity. Now open your heart and enter that secret place. Let's take it all before Him together, trusting that He's listening, that He's present, and that something real begins to happen when you decide to give yourself completely. Beloved Father, your presence is real in this moment. And just as your word teaches us, we want every thought and every intention of our heart to be aligned with you, because we know that it is in the silence before you that true transformation takes place. Lord, we thank you for all that has been revealed so far, for every teaching that has deeply touched our minds and hearts. Thank you that the Lord does not leave us trapped in confusion, fear, or anxiety, but invites us to a place of peace, clarity, and renewal. Thank you that your voice still speaks, still guides, and still transforms those who are willing to listen. Now, Father, we ask you for strength and wisdom to live all that has been learned. It teaches us to be silent when necessary, to trust when we don't understand, and to stand firm even when circumstances try to shake us. Give us a mind that is aligned with your truth, a heart sensitive to your presence, and a faith that is unwavering in the face of difficulties. Lord, look at every person who is praying right now. For those who are tired, it brings rest. For those who are overloaded in mind, it brings relief. For those facing financial struggles, it opens doors and brings provision. For those who are sick, it releases healing and restoration. For families in need of peace, it pours out reconciliation and love. And for those who feel lost, it brings clear and safe direction. At this moment, Father, in silence, each heart presents before you that which no one else sees, that which is kept, that which needs a touch from you. Receive every request, every tear, every cry that rises to you now. We commend everything into your hands, Lord, our thoughts, our fears, our dreams, and our paths. We trust that you are in control, even when we don't understand it, and we rest in the assurance that your will is perfect and your timing is exact. May your peace now invade every mind. May all oppression be broken, and may your presence become constant in the life of every person. As it is written in Psalm 19:14, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasant before your face, O Lord. May it be so in our lives. We declare that we will come out of this moment different, lighter, stronger, and closer to you. And with faith, with trust, and with surrendered hearts, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Throughout this journey, you have come to realize that silence is not emptiness, but a place where God works in a deep, invisible, and transformative way. Each teaching revealed that the mind does not need to remain trapped in fear, confusion, or anxiety, because there is a spiritual path where God reorganizes thoughts, heals emotions, and establishes a peace that the world cannot offer. This message is for you, not by chance, but because God has chosen you to hear it today. He knows your silent struggles, understands your deepest thoughts, and is inviting you to enter this place where everything begins to change from the inside out. Now the question that remains is, are you willing to silence what distracts you to finally hear what can transform your life? I am so happy to know that we are together on this journey of faith, because you are not here by coincidence. You are part of something bigger. And first of all, let me tell you, your presence here matters, your history matters. If this message spoke to you, take advantage of this moment and leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to continue receiving these words that strengthen the soul. And I really want to get to know you better, so tell me here in the comments where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little of what you are experiencing. Let's create a chain of faith together, where one strengthens the other in prayer. And it doesn't end here, because that's just a part of what God wants to show you. In the next video, you will understand even more deeply how to live in the presence of God on a daily basis and how to apply these teachings in a practical way, even in the midst of difficulties. There is something prepared for you in the next step, something that can further open your spiritual vision and bring you to a level of peace and clarity that perhaps you have never experienced before. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater, and His presence is our strength. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and see you in the next video.